Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
The 2018 budget session of the Wyoming Legislature is underway. It's been gavelled to order. And I'm Craig Blumenshine with Wyoming PBS. Welcome to our first week of Capital Outlook. On tonight's program, we'll start with a discussion of revenue, and we'll visit with the Joint Revenue Committee Chairman, Senator Ray Peterson, and Representative Mike Madden. We'll talk about their work in the interim, or lack thereof, and how maybe frustrating that was for them to go through this discussion on new revenues for the state of Wyoming. Then we'll turn to the leadership of the Wyoming Legislature, the President of the Senate, Eli Bebout, and the Speaker of the House, Steve Harshman. We'll profile Senator Bill Landen. He's from Natrona County. And we'll end with an interesting discussion on technology, about blockchain and Bitcoin, and how there are some important decisions on some really what many are calling game-changing technologies that this legislature will be talking about as the budget session moves forward. Capital Outlook Week 1 starts now.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.
And this is now week 1 of Capital Outlook. The budget session of this legislature is underway, and we want to begin a discussion with the two chairmen of the revenue committees of the Wyoming Legislature, Chairman Ray Peterson, Senator, and Representative Mike Madden. Welcome to you both to Capital Outlook.
You bet.
Thanks
for having us.
We have a lot to talk about, and we have nothing to talk about. That's kind of maybe summarizes your work in the interim. No revenue committees worked harder and longer, and with really not a lot to show for it. And I want to ask you both how frustrating your work might have been in the interim here. You guys considered potentially up to $400 and some million worth of revenue bills, with really not much that is going to be generated in any positive way in this session. Senator Peterson, let me start with you.
Well, I think when the assignment was first given to the Revenue Committee, times were different. And I was somewhat fearful of what might happen if our revenue streams did come back, how that would affect our work. And sure enough, they did. Not to the point where we enjoyed 4 or 5 years ago, but as those revenue streams started to improve, the urgency of these options kind of waned. And it's frustrating as a revenue committee. We were looking for long-term solutions on shoring up our tax streams a little bit, diversifying our tax base. You know, we talked about it, but I haven't seen the willpower in this legislative session yet.
Yet there are still lots of discussion about structural deficits, about education funding deficits. Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, and the important thing to remember, like Senator Peterson said, is that we were given this charge about a year ago. This is just about where we were a year ago. And it didn't look very good at all. And specifically, when we looked at the October Craig report, the forecast, that it was like $400 million better than we thought. And then we get to 3 months later into the January one, there's another, what is it, 150 million a year difference, or maybe it's 150 biennium, but it was much better anyway. And, you know, with that kind of promise and, you know, the stock market being high lends some credibility to the fact we might end up with capital gains. It's pretty hard to expect a committee to get excited about, you know, new revenue, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. I mean, it's one of those things that we have to keep on all the time because, you know, we talk about economic diversification, and everybody, I think, should know, if they don't know already, is that you can't have economic diversification if you don't have a way of paying the bills. So you need to have a fiscal diversified model that we certainly don't have right now, and there's not an appetite this term to do it.
Your state party told you to essentially quit talking about taxes and revenue while you were trying to do your work. You know, we need to cut spending more. Not with specific thoughts on where you should cut spending, but I felt that through your whole process you were getting torpedoed all along the way. And as we've asked many times before on this show, if the discussion can happen when times are okay, you've said, Senator, that the only time we're going to get serious about this is when we're broke.
But that's the process. The Revenue Committee, that's our job. We were given an assignment, and we told our committee right from the get-go that we're going to fulfill that assignment. But we don't do a very good job as a legislative body of sharing this information with the public, with ourselves. We go home as a citizens legislature, we go back to our jobs, and we go to the coffee house maybe and talk to 5 or 6 people. We go to a meeting once in a while with our constituents. But I think I've come to the conclusion that we need to do a better job of getting that information out. When I hear the terms like we're overtaxed in Wyoming, I've seen the figures, we're not, as compared to other states. We're simply not.
That's tough for a Republican to say.
Yeah, it is.
It really is.
It is. But I've seen the figures, we're dead last in some of these taxes, sales tax, property tax. Our tax burden in Wyoming is very light because of our 70% dependency on minerals. And we need to get that message out and let everybody get on the same page. As far as educational funding, again, we need to get that complete picture out of what assets we've got, not just on the state level, but on the school level. You know, my concern with educational funding is, and I'll be pushing this during this session, is that we allow our schools to build up 15% in cash reserves and then other accounts that they have for other projects that are not probably considered within the basket of goods, but what I refer to as fluff. So we've allowed our schools to save up for fluff items, and then the state pays for the needs. And yet that's the first account we hit, is our savings on the state level. We want us to spend down our savings. Well, our savings are used right now for the needs. And yet we let the schools continue to save up their savings for the fluff. And fluff like auditoriums, AstroTurf, stadiums, pools, the list goes on and on.
I don't think that the constituents are anywhere aware of just how low our taxes are here, you know, and how far off the mainstream that we are when it comes to, you know, simple things like business taxes. We're the only state that doesn't have a corporate income tax or a gross receipts tax in the whole Rocky Mountain area, except for one other state. And naturally, you can't do the things that a growing state needs to do to attract business when you have that kind of a tax structure. It just doesn't add up because you can't afford it, you can't finance it unless, like in our case, unless the mineral industry is booming. And that's what we use it for. We use it to pay our bills.
Mr. Chairman, you've made the comment that we're lowest in taxes and worst in economic development.
I don't think it's an accident. We had in our May meeting, we had a presentation put on by our research staff that showed what our taxes were like compared to all other states around us, plus all of the mineral states. And we were by far the lowest. And then we looked at another dimension of it, and that was our diversification over the last 20 years. We're dead last. You know, so people have to get, I think, more, they need to get out of the notion that low taxes brings about diversification, because it is contrary to diversification.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, do you agree with that low taxes is contrary to diversification?
I know that my co-chairman has taken some hits. I've taken some hits. It's an election year. We touched on that, and that's had an effect on our decisions down here as well. No one likes to talk about new taxes, but yet the challenge is that we've got to somehow diversify our tax base to prevent these boom-bust cycles in Wyoming. And so Co-Chairman Madden and myself are looking at long-term solutions, and we'll continue to propose those. And as you mentioned, I remain convinced that it's a it's a frustrating process, but those options still need to be there, and educating our constituents, educating our fellow legislators, educating our leadership on what's really out there. I don't think it's healthy to continue to draw down our savings, generating less and less interest revenue from those investments and portfolio that we manage. And it's a great thing to have investments, and it's serving the purpose. But as that comes down, it's not there, and then we have bust, and then we have nothing to fall back on.
Your question is sustainability.
Sustainability, but the idea and the philosophy of banking on and setting budgets on revenue from investments that's out there. I wouldn't do that in my home budget. I wouldn't bank on the come, and we seem to feel like it's going to work, and I feel very worried about some of the theories out there of good times are coming back and we've got our investment portfolio performing well. Last year it generated zero. So it's something that we can't profile in our budget, shouldn't profile in our budget, and I'm going to be one of those zealots that preach that continually, that we need to do better. It's a safety net, and it should be considered as such.
Mr. Chairman, you're going to get your budget next week to look at, and understanding all that you understand from the revenue side of Wyoming's picture. What goes through your mind when?
Well, what goes through my mind is based on at least on the House side, the bills we've seen be approved, or at least introduced, not approved yet, but they're on the table anyway. We're going to have a lot of spending increases that were not profiled in the budget before the session started. And that's going to have an effect in turn on how much rainy day money we use. And I guess my interest right now is to see that budget as it would appear in a week from now, to see how much money we're actually spending in the face of no new revenue. That's where I'm at. I just think that people are, at least in the House side, are really preoccupied with the notion that we just need to spend all of the savings we have until we're clear broke, and then we'll do something about it. It's kind of like ignoring it and pretending it'll go away.
Were you successful in your interim work? Do you feel successful?
Well, I did. I think we have a lot of options that if the attitude changes next year, that there's something there that is on the shelf that we can use and consider and introduce. They're all prepared and they're all ready. And I mean, I think we have something to show for it.
So what will you do between end of session now in this interim? You'll both still be chairman of the committee
right.
until the next elections. What's your plan?
Well, one plan I have is to do a better job of getting the information out there, and I think we need to work at that. I'd like to see brochures or leaflets with the actual figures of tax burden on our citizens, and we need to get our story out there, the real challenges that we're facing as a legislature, trying to address the structural deficit and the revenue streams, as well as our goals and what we're trying to achieve here. If we can all get on the same page, I go back home and my constituents say, you need to start spending those rainy day accounts. Well, they're about 3 years behind because we've been tapping that rainy day account for 3 years, trying to balance our budgets. And so those kind of misunderstandings need to be cleared up and get everybody on the same page and give them a real picture of what's actually happening.
Mr. Chairman, are you on the same page there? And do you see that 70-30 ratio changing? Well,
certainly isn't going to change this term, or this session. I mean, it's got, sooner or later it'll have to turn. We've got lots of other states that have gone through the same thing that we're going through now, and it isn't an easy process. It isn't it's going to require change, and change isn't easy for people, especially old people like me, to deal with. And in the school foundation program, it's more like 80% is minerals, and these people don't even live here. And you try to say increase the amount of money that residents pay for education, and they go up in arms. I mean,
I think if people understand the process, they should understand that we're just doing our job. And the process works down here. We knew it was going to be a tough sell when we came down to this session, and it's turning out that we just don't have the willpower to do that, to make those changes yet, as Co-Chairman Madden has just mentioned. And so I guess it's up to us and other leadership in the legislature to continue the topic, continue the discussion on the challenges that we face, and maybe we'll get there in baby steps. I don't know.
To both of you, I've observed you both with intense pressure in the meetings that you run, and you couldn't be more cordial to the constituents of Wyoming, and I appreciate that work.
Well, thank you, Greg.
Thank you very much. I try to do that every day.
Yep, and I think you both succeed. Welcome. Onward now in our Capital Outlook show. Up next, the leadership of the Wyoming Legislature will visit with President Eli Bebout and Speaker Steve Harshman. That's next. Stay with us. And as we continue our weekly discussions with the Speaker of the House, Representative Steve Harshman, and the President of the Senate, Senator Eli Bebout, we want to reflect a little bit on the Governor's State of the State address as we begin our time together today. The Governor certainly touched on a lot of things. Generally, before we get into more details, what we're going to talk about today, what were your thoughts when you were watching the Governor?
The Governor delivered what I thought is what a State of the State address should be. You know, his perspective and his forward thinking about our state, the love he has for Wyoming, the dedication to our great state, and the specifics of his speech were spot on. And he talked about diversification. He covered the whole gamut. I thought it was a very positive speech. It set the tone for the session. And I'm looking forward to working with him on all the issues he outlined. I think it was very good. Very
Mr.
good.
Speaker, what were you thinking when he was...
Well, I think, too, I think all those things, real positive speech, but you look at his family there, who's basically half their childhood. He's been governor, growing up right in front of everybody. And I think, so there was always that time to reflect a little bit. I think towards the end, I don't think there was a dry eye in the place. But I think as much as anything about, how Wyoming, we're going to control our own destiny. And I think that's really a key on how we think and the things that we do.
And the Governor said exactly that. We want to roll this clip for our viewers, and then we're going to come back and start to talk about it.
Sometimes out of adversity, in our case, the recent energy downturn comes opportunity. The opportunity is the Endow Initiative. I announced the initiative in November 2016. The objective is to develop a 20-year economic strategy and then implement it over 20 years in order to grow and expand our economy. The legislature did great work last year authorizing the initiative and funded it with $2.5 million. And Endow took off in 2017. I hear the enthusiasm across the state for Endow, particularly from our young people. I also hear skepticism. We must listen to both camps, but I reject the notion that Wyoming is incapable of determining its own destiny, that our future will only be determined by commodity prices or other exterior forces. Surely the equality state, the cowboy state, has a belief in self-determination.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, the Governor wants to take a serious look on Wyoming's future, and his mechanism to do that is the Endow program. A lot of discussion this week, a late night in Management Council Tuesday night with Endow bills. Fascinating discussion. What did you take away from your Management Council meeting earlier this week where these bills advanced?
Well, I think the main thing is you got to get going. And all our surrounding states and our competitors are creating really atmospheres. It's not like government's going in. We always get criticized. Government's picking winners and losers. It's not about that. It's about creating an atmosphere where winners will pick us. And I think, and setting up kind of the whole, there gets to be kind of a churn is what the young people who are, the entrepreneurs who are talking to us, a churn or an interest or a momentum gets going, and I think that's so important. And Wyoming is right at the cusp of that. It's happening all around us, just blowing up in northern Colorado and the Wasatch Range in Utah and even Montana.
Mr. President, you talked about maybe backing off a little bit with the amount of money allocated by this legislature for entrepreneurial development.
The key to it is how we do it. The implementation, and there's some concerns out there, and they're valid. The devil will be in the detail, and that's part of what, when we look at these different programs, and I believe there's 5 of them, Mr. Speaker, and I've been working on, that really tie into this. We've got the connectivity one, we've got the entrepreneurial one, we've got workforce development, we've got air service, and the last one was international trade. All very, very important. And the way we present those and how we set it up to get it done and get the end results we want to measure it with specifics is the key. And that's why I think when we look at these, as we move forward, we got to do it right. And we will do it right. And that's why I think some of the funding in that should be delayed until we maybe have a little further time to look at them. And before we leave the whole thing about the diversity and economic development piece, we need to understand and continue to work on adding value to our minerals. You know, and that's so critical because the jobs you create with processing plants and different things, whether it be oil, gas, coal, uranium, whatever, is huge. And let's don't forget just the responsible development of these minerals, drilling more wells, oil and gas, the Powder River Basin opportunities there. We don't want to forget that. That brought us to the table. So that's still critical as well.
I'd agree, Mr. President. I think there was a group of us went on a real legislative junket. We flew on a Saturday during the session up to Edmonton, Alberta. It was about 10 degrees here. It was minus 36 up there. But we got to see the Heartland complex and really how they've just a value-added chain. And so we put into the budget that year, run a budget amendment to try to, and we're trying to, so these things take time, but that's a section of one of the endow bills is to really force state lands and endow to go out and let's identify these areas. That was in the original draft legislation. Now let's go out and find these pre-permit so companies, can come in and get consistency and get going right away. And so there's a lot of pieces to that.
On to budget.
Yeah.
Yeah. So initially we'll talk standard budget. Any other budget concerns that you might have relative to budget as well, Mr. Speaker?
This budget is smaller than any budget in 10 years. Fewer employees than any budget in 10 years. And so I think that's the thing. In Wyoming, we're trying to run a lean operation.
The Republican Party, and we talked about this earlier in the show with the chairman of the Revenue Committee, though, said, stop the talk about revenue, continue the talk about spending cuts, but I have not heard specific from the party about spending cuts. And what does that mean to you, Mr. President, going forward?
And there is a huge structural deficit out there. We all know that. But we're continuing to make progress. And, I think we're down 20% in terms of the spending relative to revenues and what we've done over the past couple of years. So we're making progress. Part of that has to be broadening our tax base.
And do you anticipate then that the budget given to you by the JAC will be cut further by both your bodies?
Generally, that's
are there
not what
specifics
happens.
available? Sure.
Folks generally will add to it on the floor, is my general experience over the years.
It is a balanced budget. It's just the fact that these monies will not be there forever. Revenues come up in terms of some investments down the road that are positive, then we will have more revenues available.
Mr. Speaker, are you on the same page here?
Well, I think where the President and I differ is when I was, I think, my third year in the legislature, and the Perm Mill Trust Fund was $2 billion, and it spun off $50 million that year. And that's for folks at home, that's an endowment. That's a constitutionally protected fund. And so once, all of a sudden, our revenues went up, and all of us started, bill came across from the Senate Schiffer, and I got buttons made. I made the goal for a legislative 4x10 plan, and people couldn't even imagine 2010 would ever get here. But to double the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund by 2010. And the power of compounding money is Albert Einstein's most powerful force in the universe, and particularly when it's working for you. So then when we get to 2010, we have $4 billion. Mr. President, I say we're going 8 by 18. And we're at $8 billion now in our Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. We're in a situation, as I said, compound interest is a beautiful thing, particularly when it's working for you. And I think there's a point now, I think we've got the most conservative trust funds in the world. We have massive reserve accounts that'll back up spending and revenue. And so we're going to have to see this transition where revenue from our investments are about 20% of our budget. And it hasn't been that high. We haven't used it fully, but I think, the Business Alliance poll talked about that, other issues, but I think we've got to continue to have that discussion. You can't tell people, hey, we don't recognize this $8 billion and the money that it spends off. And so that's where we probably differ, and we're going to continue to have those debates.
Discussion on whether to make the 1% diversion into the general fund a permanent solution.
I'm opposed to that.
That failed.
I'm opposed to that.
But it's still in the budget for this year.
Absolutely, and of course the importance of that 1%, and one of the reasons we're able to get to the $8 billion is because that's how you inflation-proof your permanent funds. And if you take that money away and use it for ongoing spending, then you don't inflation-proof your funds. So I would like to see us down the road, have that go back or part of it back to the fund. And as the speaker said, if we hadn't got to $8 billion and what we've done and been able to do, we'd be in worse shape.
No question, though, we're saving less now.
Oh, we should. I mean, you think about it. You think there's 6 cents severance on oil and gas, and constitutionally we have a 1.5 that goes into the permanent fund. So 25% of the severance we have to save. It goes into the permanent fund. What we were doing is taking another percent, right? It got us up to about 44% of the severance was being saved permanently. It was a wonderful thing. And we were able to do it. We were multi-billionaires, and we were able to provide services, save cash, and grow our investments. But I think it's just like anybody at home. If your revenue gets restricted, you're not going to keep saving 44% of your other income in permanent savings. You'd have to back off, or you're going to have to get another job, or you're going to have to, cut somehow. And I just don't think that'd be the first thing people would responsibly cut back. We'll still save. We're just not going to save 44% of our severance.
And I think that the difference too, and the fact that we have the revenue, the opportunity investment is very positive. But I'm more of I want to see the money there before we start spending it, and that's where we have a little difference. But we'll work that out. We really will.
You advocating for a permanent then 1% diversion into the general?
Well, I'm not so worried about the permanent 1% diversion. I think we can continue to do that in the budget, and I'm not worried about that. I think the key is on this revenue from investments, and I think, and it's really about whether we're going to energize our trust funds now. And so our whole budget's built on projections, right? We don't have the money in the bank. No government does. And so we're profiling what we think the price of oil is going to be, what sales taxes will be, all those things. A diversified portfolio is pretty stable. And we have a massive diversified portfolio, I think, should flow into that mix. I think it'll be one of the more stable revenue pieces we have. This 20-day session is the shortest in the country. And we're going to get more work done than most folks around the country anywhere. We're going to pass dozens of bills and balance the budget. And nobody else does that in 20 days. It's unheard of.
We'll be back to talk more about that next week.
I know.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. On now to a profile. We're going to visit personally with Senator Bill Landen. We visited with him a few weeks ago at his home in Casper, and we'd like to bring that to you right now.
It's my privilege to be visiting with my old boss,
well, how
Senator
about
Bill
that?
Landen.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Craig.
It's great to see you.
Great to see you.
Just for our viewers, you were sports editor at the Riverton Ranger when I first met you. That was a couple years ago.
That was just a handful of years ago. My first job out of the University of Wyoming, and I had the great opportunity to go to work for the PECs, and was sports editor of the Riverton Ranger. And there was this high school baseball reporter that came in to work for me, and
you got to edit all
that
of his
was you,
mistakes.
Craig.
Yeah.
By golly, we worked together and we covered lots of baseball games.
It was a lot of fun. The Ranger would do a baseball edition.
Yeah, do you remember
every
that?
summer? I absolutely do.
All those box scores, and boy, you were
Covered
diligent.
Little League like no other.
Did a great job. Yeah, that was fun.
And now, Senator, you're about 10 years into your service in the legislature.
It's hard to believe, Craig. It's obviously one of the greatest privileges and honors I've ever been given. Outside of a beautiful wife who's very smart and talented and keeps me on the straight and narrow, and then 3 very well-adjusted kids who are doing great. The legislative experience has been one of the great privileges.
When you look back, I mean, you were a longtime administrator at Casper College, 30 years.
Yeah. I stepped away from that 2 years ago. I just thought 30 years was a nice round number. What a great experience. I learned a great deal, and hopefully helped Casper College along the way to stay as good as it was.
Before we start talking about your service, Senator, your father's still alive. He lives in Du Bois, a long-time state of Wyoming employee and a World War II veteran.
Well, thanks for asking about Orv. Orv is one of Wyoming's treasures. He's a World War II vet. He likes to say that he crawled across France on his hands and knees, and he was wounded in action over there, and made it back home and went to work for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, and they stationed him in Du Bois, Wyoming. Darned if that's not where he met my mother, and so that's where Dad is today. Du Bois has been kind of his home base ever since. Yeah.
So there was a time in your life you wanted to run for the legislature. What made you do that?
Boy, that's a great question. You know, I mentioned to you that I went to work for the Pecks years and years ago, and Roy Peck was really who hired me. At that time, he was serving in the legislature, and later on, his brother Bob went ahead and served in the legislature as well. In the meantime, I had gone on from the Ranger and I went to work for Craig Thomas. At that time, the Wyoming Rural Electric Association. Craig, of course, went on to become our United States Senator and did such a terrific job that the day that we lost him was really the turning point for me, Craig. And I sat there wondering if good people don't step up and offer to do some of this work, how are we going to replace people like Craig Thomas? Well, you never do, but and then State Senator John Barrasso was selected to go back and replace Craig, and he happened to be our state senator, and Robin and I talked about it and decided to offer to do this.
You've served on many committees, and uniquely you've been on the Revenue Committee and the Appropriations Committee where you're serving right now. It's kind of a unique perspective. And I'm curious, 10 years down the road, where do you see Wyoming? Are we going to be able to continue on with the revenue streams that we have, which you're well familiar with, the way we're spending, which you're well familiar with, certainly not as much as it was a few years ago. Are you confident that our state can still move forward?
You know, Craig, I'm about as optimistic as I ever have been. I love this state and I love the position that we're in. We've been through a couple of down years, and we've been through that before. These last couple of years have been a little bit of a struggle, and we've had to fight very, very hard, as you know, to try to alleviate that structural deficit that we have in our state spending. And so we've done that. We've reduced some budgets. We're looking for efficiencies, and at the same time, we're taking a hard look at where those streams of money go. We've been fortunate enough to put a lot of money in reserves over the years. We may not be able to do as much of that now.
Does that worry you from our future? Because that's been Wyoming's tradition.
Well, that's true, and I'm so proud of that effort, by the way. We used lots of times I would come home here to Casper and people would ask me, well, Bill, why aren't you spending that money? Why are you socking everything away and you're putting it all in the rainy day account? Well, I don't get asked that anymore, and thank goodness we had that vision to put that money away, and I think it's time that we can start leveraging some of that reserve funding that we put in place. Permanent Mineral Trust Fund is up to, $7 or $8 billion. It's becoming about the third greatest source of income to the general fund. So very proud of that, and I think we have an opportunity to utilize that to kind of soften this blow, and I think we'll be well poised to go forward.
What kind of hills or hurdles do you see on the horizon for Wyoming that kind of keep you up a little bit longer at night than Robin would like?
Well, there's a couple of things, Craig. That's a great question. I worry about mental health and substance abuse in our state, and I worry about our correction system. We're bulging at the seams right now in our corrections units. We have over 2,000 male inmates and another 300 female inmates knocking on the door for the need for some more facilities. The other thing that kind of keeps me up at night, we talk about economic diversity, but one of the biggest challenges we have is how are we going to get the strength in numbers that we can attract good businesses here and provide the workforce that they need. I think that's one of our greatest challenges. We don't have a lot of folks. It hit home for us about 1.5 years ago when our son Nick decided to begin to think about having to go somewhere else. We're not building a whole lot of buildings here in Wyoming. He's an engineer, and he has ended up down on the Front Range of the state to our south, and it was hard to see him go. you hate to lose your best and your brightest, and so I'm hopeful that some of this effort that's been going on, the governor's Endow initiative, I think, is spot on a couple of things. We've got to build our infrastructure with broadband. We've got to continue that fight. I think we've got great opportunity, and I'm optimistic. We just had a wonderful company move into Sheridan the other day. That was good news, and I think it's onward and upward from here.
You're a longtime sports official. I'm not sure that everyone in Wyoming knows that, but you refereed high school basketball a long time. Why did you want to keep that connection to high school athletics?
You know, I absolutely loved the camaraderie with the coaches. They weren't always enamored with us as officials, but so many friends across the state, and it was such a great connection with our young people. I love being out on the court with young people and helping them to have a good, fair contest, learn and grow up. Had a lot of conversations out there on the court with great players and great kids through the years. Ironically, that's one of the things that I miss the most. Serving in Cheyenne doesn't afford me the time or opportunity to referee basketball anymore.
Keep with the school topic here. You've thought a lot about how our schools are funded in Wyoming, and certainly recognize the deficit that school funding is in. If I gave you the magic wand and you alone could tell us how we're going to fund schools from now on, what would you tell me?
Well, Wyoming's in a unique position because the Supreme Court, through the 4 Campbell decisions, has basically ruled and taken over control of what we do for education. And really what those 4 cases said was, every student in the state of Wyoming deserves the same education. Nobody can argue with that, but what it's basically done is taken away some of our local control at being able to build some schools or to fund some things that a local community might want to fund. In its stead, we've had a state system that has pretty much funded our schools now with the assistance of our local districts. But that state funding, when it gets tight like this, it makes it very, very challenging for us to be able to buoy those districts up the way they'd like to be.
So I'm giving you the power now. Yeah. How are you going to fund schools?
I think we give the opportunity for those districts to tax themselves.
Will that keep things equitable?
I think you'd have to be careful in a constitutional amendment to have the ability to recapture some of that, so that you could equalize, because we do have districts out there that simply cannot fund themselves in a situation like that. But I want to give more empowerment to the districts out across there. That's one thing. The other thing is, we really do have to talk about some diversification in our taxation system. We rely about 70% of the funding of our schools comes from the minerals industry. Through assessed valuation, through the local coffers as well as the state coffers. That's why when the economy goes down in Wyoming, the state of Wyoming actually gets a double whammy, because we not only lose the funding at the state level, we have to replenish the coffers at the district level. So we take a double hit trying to keep the districts where they were. So I think it's important as we go along here. Now's the time for us to begin to talk about a different way of doing business.
You mentioned those words, diversifying the tax structure. Yeah. What's that mean to you?
Well, it actually, unfortunately for a lot of folks, it means how much do we all spend to have the quality of life that we have in Wyoming? And we've been so lucky through the years. In fact, we're just so fortunate to have the kind of minerals industry that we do. And as I mentioned before, it funds a huge percentage of everything we do in Wyoming. And it might be time for us to look at things like, how do we treat our corporations that we invite into our state? Are they bringing resources with them, or are they taking resources away from an already pretty hard-pressed situation? You take a local entity, for example. Sometimes you put a brand new business in there and you put all those new workers in, but are you recapturing any of the tax that it might take to pay for your fire and your sewer and your water and all of the services.
Educate those kids.
And educate those kids. Exactly right, Craig.
Senator Landon, it's been a pleasure to visit with you and to have known you for such a long time. It's great seeing you in Cheyenne, and thank you so much for
Craig,
spending some time with us.
It's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure, Craig. Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
And as we begin our final segment on Capital Outlook tonight, we're going to get into some technology, some words maybe that you've heard before but maybe don't completely understand, and it's something the Wyoming Legislature is trying to take a serious look at. At the same time, we consider that computer coding is relevant for all K-12 students in Wyoming. I want to welcome Representative Dave Miller. He's the House Majority Floor Leader, Representative Tyler Lindholm, and Representative Jared Olson. To all of you, welcome to Capital Outlook.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
So we're talking about Bitcoin and blockchain, and I think to some people that is a foreign language, and they are not synonyms either. And I want to just get into a basic overview of that, and then I want to understand what bills are being brought forward and why it's important that Wyoming right now understands and then acts on bills that impact this technology. So Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency that we've all maybe heard about and we may not understand. Who wants to take the first crack at what Bitcoin is?
Sure. So Bitcoin is a digital currency that comes about off of a mathematical equation. It's essentially mined via computers that are essentially smashing this algorithm over and over again. And there's 21 million ways to solve this algorithm for Bitcoin. And that's specific to that cryptocurrency. And as computers use a lot of data and power to create one of those one of those bitcoins, they create one, and it's a long process. And that's kind of always been the level by which these are mined: is that how much power are you consuming versus how many bitcoins are you able to mine. So that's kind of essentially what a bitcoin is.
As I understand the technology of blockchain, just to maybe give our viewers a visual.
Sure.
Bitcoin is a currency. Blockchain is the infrastructure that supports the currency. Imagine, if you will, bales of hay. That each bale might be a block. Okay? And then within that block or within that bale is information. It could be Bitcoin. It could be a governmental contract. It could be a contract that an attorney might have. It could be an asset. Is that an accurate, maybe very generalized description of what blockchain is?
Yeah, I think if you were to sum it up in 2 words, a blockchain is a digital ledger. And when you compare it with cryptocurrency, I think the easiest way to think about it is cryptocurrency needs the blockchain. It exists on the blockchain. But blockchain doesn't need cryptocurrency. It's the broader base, like you said, that it's built on. But it really, in most simplest terms, it's a digital record-keeping system, a ledger.
And I think another important point is this is a distributed system. In other words, there's not just one line of bales of hay, for example. They exist in hundreds or thousands of lines where they're all the same, and that if one is impacted, they're all not impacted. Is that an accurate way to maybe describe the underlying security?
That's actually what makes blockchain unhackable. And that's what actually makes it pretty exciting, is the encryption and the technology behind it. A better word would be decentralized. And that's what hackers depend on when they actually go after your assets. They depend on a centralized location where they can hack in. And so that's why blockchain hasn't been hacked, is based on the premise that there's one area that a hacker could go in, and because that cannot be verified by the other nodes of the blockchain, it's automatically rejected. And so that's why there's a lot of companies moving that direction, big companies, Fortune 500 companies, and a lot of governments too.
This is probably the most important aspect of it, because it's mathematical formulas duplicated on hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of computers around the world. And when one doesn't match another one, it's thrown out. And so it's it's unhackable compared to our conventional systems right now that have an administrator. You're familiar with that. If someone gets inside the system, if some dishonest person penetrates, then everything is vulnerable. This has yet to be penetrated.
Well, blockchain transactions are in some cases public and in some cases private. There are private blockchains and there are public blockchains. public blockchain perhaps can enhance transparency of government. It can enhance transparency and prevent voter fraud. Perhaps blockchains might be used someday to house medical records. All then theoretically attackable, but in reality, not only just in theory, safer.
More secure.
And would you both agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's on point, and that's kind of along the lines of a lot of folks have asked what can we use a blockchain for, and it's really along the lines of what Representative Olson stated. When you're looking at a ledger, the question isn't what can I put on a ledger, it's what can't you put on a ledger. I mean, really everything.
I want to read what Jerry Cuomo, the Vice President for Blockchain Technologies at IBM, said just this morning. He said, "We at IBM believe that blockchain is a revolutionary technology. With blockchain, we can reimagine many of the world's most fundamental business processes and open the door to new styles of digital interactions that we have yet to imagine." That's pretty hard for us in Wyoming to get our head around. And it begs the question, why is Wyoming interested in blockchain, and what is the legislature trying to do? Let's start there. There are 5 bills that I believe that are relevant to this discussion.
This is huge. We have 5 bills: House Bill 19, House Bill 70, House Bill 101, House Bill 126, and 1 Senate file, and we don't have the number of that one yet. And as a package, this is going to leap Wyoming to the forefront of this technology. So we have a real leadership position here that we can grasp. Now, whether we get all these bills through the House and the Senate and the governor's signature, the governor's behind this. The governor was at the Blockchain Coalition
behind
reception.
You mean in favor of?
In favor, absolutely. It's we consider it part of his Endow program. I think this probably can change the economic environment in Wyoming more than any other thing we're even thinking about right now. Could this potentially replace a lot of the mineral production? I do think that.
On that scale?
On that, not necessarily on that scale, but in tens of percentages of that scale.
Okay. We'll get back to that, about some ancillary benefits in just a moment, but Representative Lindholm, continue his thoughts.
Right, so what we're looking at and why this is important for Wyoming to do has to do with the fact that no other state has done this. Craig, it's one of those aspects where it puts us beyond, where we're not competing with states anymore. We're competing with countries. And so that's really exciting. Congress hasn't taken action on this because they're still waiting and watching what other states do and what other countries do. And if we pass this legislation, this puts Wyoming in the lead on a regulatory aspect that doesn't cost the taxpayers of the state of Wyoming one dime and opens up the doors for these new ways to comport business in the technology world. And because of that, we had countries from Switzerland, we had we had companies from Switzerland come, we had companies from Silicon Valley come to an event the other night from all over the United States and from several different places in the world. So that's what this is about.
I can attest there are people all over the halls in this temporary capital here in Wyoming that are very interested, I think, in the work that you're doing. Representative Olson, you also sponsored a bill. I believe it's House Bill 126 relative to limited liability companies. How does that interact with the world of blockchain?
Sure, absolutely, and just to, if I could say one word as to what is the drive behind all this for me, it's diversification. So I think the implications of my bill, but all of these bills as a package are even broader than blockchain. I think the implications are inviting to a tech community around the world. And so I think when we talk about business growth, we'll see, I think, growth even outside of blockchain developers and folks interested in the blockchain community. My bill, HB 126, how it fits in is a bill that provides or authorizes series LLCs. And that's simply just parent LLCs owned by baby LLCs. So it's in a series. It is a preferred method of incorporation for blockchain developers, but also for tech communities in general. So I think that with the advancement of that legislation, we also broaden the door for even greater formation of businesses, and hopefully they domicile here as well in the tech community.
I should point out that Wyoming was the first state to recognize or to create and invent LLCs.
Back in the late 1970s. And this is critical because, again, we heard comments the other night that Delaware, where lots of businesses are incorporated in LLC now, they generate $1.3 billion a year. You were asking the magnitude of dollars we're talking about. Well, $1.3 billion puts us up into oil, gas, and coal type territory.
Okay, so let's go there now. What are Wyomingites potentially going to see? Are they going to see massive data centers? Are they going to see creative coders? How will Wyoming realize an economic benefit in its economy?
All of the above,
all right,
in my opinion.
Everyone agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. When we're looking at this aspect and we're looking at business registrations, I think that's great. And if businesses just at the very base level just wanted to register in the state of Wyoming because of our friendly business laws, that's great, because that helps pave the roads, that's pays for our schools, all of those things that a business is helping to pay for. But really what we're looking at is we're looking at companies that have already said we're coming. In fact, we've already got a company that moved here because of these bills even being looked at. With that being in place, those are jobs, those are real jobs. And we didn't have to attract them here with money. We just said, you can do business here.
An ancillary benefit, perhaps. You're talking about power eating facilities.
Yeah.
Utilizing potentially Wyoming generated power.
Right.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, and that's an awesome aspect of it. We produce power or energy in the state of Wyoming probably in more ways than any other state in the nation, and we're proud of that fact. Coal, natural gas, wind. I don't think we've got a lot of solar out there, but just the same, who knows? And that aspect makes us pretty proud. If you can drive down Interstate 25, you can see the Laramie River Power Station. You go up Interstate 90, you can see Dry Fork Power Station, you can see Wyodak, you can see all of these different aspects of Wyoming energy, and we're eager to sell it, and this aspect is hungry. So.
And what I would add to the aspect of that, when we're talking about data centers, but when we're talking about, let's talk for a minute about mining centers. So, for the same
let me interrupt just a moment. That's such a hard word for Wyoming because mining is not in the context that we all think it is. Right. So expand on that just a little bit.
So if we're talking about mining cryptocurrency, so going out and pulling cryptocurrency out of the digital world and turning it into something.
Technology scooping, is that a better way than mining? Just to make,
That's fair, but my point is that for all the same reasons that data centers are attracted to Wyoming, those centers would be attracted to Wyoming as well. For example, climate. Our cooler climate allows for that greater, room full of warming technology to stay cooler with less energy use and frankly, less cost overhead.
Another aspect, of course, is our cheap energy in Wyoming. We have some of the lowest electrical rates in the country. And frankly, we need more demand in Wyoming. We only consume maybe 10 or 15% of the power generated in Wyoming. And we have the potential to generate a lot more. There's a number of wind farms that are on the drawing boards right now that this technology and people coming here in a flood could be a game changer. And let me comment on one other thing. You were trying to get at where this is really high-tech driven, but it applies basically to everything, even to ag people, even to gun manufacturers. And in Tyler's bill today on initial coin offerings, I thought the committee was having trouble getting their head around it. So I did a Wyoming aspect to that, and I said, well, how about a gun manufacturer wants to issue 1,000 tokens at $500 a piece to basically, you're pre-selling that gun with that token, and you can do that in an ICO.
Using blockchain.
And it's not a security. You're getting a real asset for that, and that would give that manufacturer $500,000 to work with to jumpstart. Now, who does not that apply to? It applies to everyone across the board.
I mean, you can just go through, bankers, real estate.
Absolutely.
The whole 9 yards. We have just a few seconds left. Any red flags with this technology that you've come across that you think are worth paying really attention to?
I think the biggest thing right out front is Arizona immediately copied our legislation and is trying to steal Wyoming's thunder on this. It is absolutely paramount that we are the first on this, otherwise you are last. And so we're going double time. This legislation is going to be seen on general file tomorrow, and we're getting after it.
This is critical to do it now. Even in committee today, I heard some people that didn't understand the technology as maybe we ought to do an interim study. Well, we just as soon kiss it goodbye if we have to do that, because we're going to miss the opportunity. Wyoming can be the leader in this. And even if we beat everyone else by 3 months, we still beat them. Yep. Okay?
Be very interesting to watch this technology for sure evolve and how it evolves here in Wyoming. We'll have more to learn about this, and we'll dedicate a whole Wyoming Chronicle to this later in the summer or the fall.
Great.
And we'll be interested to visit with you all about this. So, Representative Jared Olson, Tyler Lindholm, Majority Floor Leader Dave Miller, thank you so much for joining us on Capitol Outlook. And that's a wrap for today's show. To our viewers across Wyoming who watched today, thank you so very much. We look forward to coming back to you next Friday night during the second week here of the 2018 budget session of the Wyoming Legislature. Until then, from all of us at Wyoming PBS and for our friends at the Wyoming Legislature, thank you very much for watching.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.